Martez Mott to give a great talk today in the HCIL Brown Bag. Martez Mott is a senior researcher in the Ability Group at Microsoft Research. So let's round of applause for the Ability Group at Microsoft Research. Focused on designing, implementing, evaluating intelligent interaction techniques that improve the accessibility of computing devices for people with diverse motor and sensory abilities. His current research focuses on identifying and overcoming accessibility barriers embedded in the design of virtual and augmented reality systems. Martez is passionate about improving diversity in the computer science and the human-computer interaction communities. He co-chaired the 2020 CHI-ME workshop, is serving on the steering committee for CHI-ME 2021, and he co-founded the Black Researchers at MSR at Microsoft Research Group. Martez received his PhD in information science from the iSchool at the University of Washington, and prior to UW, he received his BS and MS in computer science from Bowling Green State University. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Martez Mott, but he's also a member of the organizing committee for Assets 2021. So I want to personally, as general chair of Assets 2021, want to personally thank Martez as well. So Martez, please take it away. We look forward to your great talk.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, Jonathan. I really appreciate it. And thank you all so much for having me. I'm really excited to be able to have this opportunity to share some of the work we've been doing at Microsoft Research with some of my interns and other collaborators in the lab. So let me go ahead and share my screen to get started here. Okay, so I first wanted to just kind of say some of this work is work in progress. So, what I really wanted to be able to do today is to kind of highlight some of the problem spaces that we've identified so far in our work in trying to understand how to improve the accessibility of virtual reality systems. So while I may not present a lot of quote unquote like solutions today, what I hope to do is to be able to kind of give you some insights into what some of these possible design challenges are, and then hopefully we can have a conversation, like as a community, about what we need to do to make these systems more accessible to people who might have diverse abilities. So what I'm going to talk to you all today about is accessible virtual reality for people with limited mobility. Like Jonathan said, my name is Martez Mott. I'm a senior researcher at Microsoft Research in the Ability Group. Yeah, so quick background. Bachelor's and Master's Computer Science, Bowling Green State University. This is like an aerial view of Bowling Green. It's a small Midwestern school in Bowling Green, Ohio. And then after there, I went to Seattle, where I got my PhD in information science at the University of Washington. I graduated in 2018. So it's like an aerial view of Seattle, much better topography in Seattle than at Bowling Green. And then currently I'm a senior researcher in the Ability Group at Microsoft Research. So what I wanted to do today is to provide an overview. So it's really going to happen in these 4 parts. So first, I want to provide a really brief kind of introduction to accessible computing, and really to talk about it in terms of like how I see it in my research. So like how I approach accessible computing research. And then that's going to lead into this kind of research approach kind of section, which I'm going to discuss some of my prior projects that kind of gives you a sense of the general types of research I do. And then I'm going to talk about kind of what we're doing to look more towards accessible virtual reality and what these future opportunities could be. Another quick note before I get started, this is also research that's happening during the time of COVID. So there's interesting kind of methodological questions at play here too about like, how can you really explore some of these themes, when it's really difficult to actually be in a room with someone or to actually be able to have the opportunity for people to try systems firsthand. So, I would love if people have any thoughts or any comments about, what they've been doing during the pandemic, in terms of doing some of these type of user research methods. So I just kind of want to throw that out there as just kind of like a future point of discussion, perhaps. Okay. All right, so first I want to get this like little brief background of how I think about accessible computing. Okay, so feel free to call me out on any of this stuff. Like once again, this is kind of my conceptualization of it and how I approach it in my research. So I really look at accessible computing as designing computing devices and services to be usable by all people and using computing to make the world more accessible to people with disabilities. So this is kind of the lens in which I approach accessible computing, the devices, the services, can we make those accessible? How can we leverage devices and services to make the physical world more accessible? So this is this one approach that I like to take. And as many of you probably already know, there's lots of different design principles or design guidelines or design frameworks we can use to be able to help us design better accessible systems. So universal design is probably the canonical example. And I'm going to give a definition here from 1995, which says universal design is the design of products and environments that can be used and experienced by people of all ages and abilities to the greatest extent possible without adaptation. So universal design originally comes out of more like built environments like architecture, and originally was more attuned to how do you improve the accessibility of these type of built environments, in a sense been co-opted by lots of different disciplines to understand, well, how can you just build better, more inclusive whatever, depending on whatever it is you're building. So kind of like, these two examples that people kind of give all the time, like curb cuts, so if you could provide curb cuts that can improve accessibility from getting to sidewalk to the street and vice versa for people with, who use wheelchairs or power chairs, but it's also great for people who might be riding a bike or on a skateboard or pushing a grocery cart, something like that. And then closed captions, which can provide text representations of audio information, can be really great for people who might be deaf or hard of hearing, but it's also great, right, if you're like at a crowded bar, you just kind of want to hear like the announcement or something, right? Or you have like a newborn and you're trying to rock them to sleep while you're just trying to watch TV or something. So a lot of great examples, but I want to go back to this definition of universal design again. So just to reiterate, it says the design of products and environments that can be used and experienced by people of all ages and abilities to the greatest extent possible without adaptation. So I've kind of underline and bolded the word abilities here because it begs this question, like, well, what is ability? If we're saying that we want to be able to design products and environments that can be used by people of all ages and abilities, well, what do we mean by ability? What does it mean for somebody to have ability? So in my work, I like to use this framework called ability-based design that was established by my PhD advisor, Jacob Rohrbach, and his colleagues, in which they think about it as understanding human abilities and then giving systems the opportunity to adapt or be adapted to people's alternative abilities. So the definition here is it's a design approach in which the human abilities required to operate an interactive system are questioned, and systems adapt or can be adapted to alternative abilities. So it puts this focus on abilities kind of first, right? It says we need to think about what abilities people possess. And then once we know that, then we can make our system smarter and they can adapt themselves to be able to accommodate whatever abilities people may have. So this still doesn't get to this question though, of what is ability? So this very quick definition is, you could think of it as just the ability is the possession of the means or skill to do something. So we all have some abilities we all possess the means or skills to do something. And you can contrast that kind of with, how we typically think about disability. So this is a definition of disability from the World Health Organization from 2001. And this is kind of what we call like the social model of disability, in terms of saying what a person can do isn't just given innate to that person. It's actually it's socially constructed. It's actually dependent on the task that person is doing, the environment that person is in, what the environment allows that person to do. It's going to all feed into the accessibility of whatever the context can be. So these are all important concepts to keep in mind when you're thinking about, well, what is ability? What is accessibility? Because this makes it very clear that like context matters. You can't just think about accessibility without also thinking about context as well. So what I really like about ability-based design, and it gives us this, what we call this positive affirmation of ability. So it says that everyone has abilities, some people more than others, and we need to design for people with abilities of all types. So, I think we can all agree that, hey, there are some things that we can do all to varying degrees, but the important thing is that we leverage what people can do. That's the thing we pay attention to. What people can do, we leverage that to the best of our abilities. Okay, so that was just like really quick primer on kind of mostly accessible computing, but have really ability-based design and the framework I use to approach some of my work. So to kind of give a little bit more concrete examples, typically what I like to do when I do my research, like how I approach it, is I like to question what we call ability assumptions. So I'm going to make the statement here, which is that all human operated technologies contain embedded ability assumptions, whether explicit or implicit. So you can maybe think about this as like the affordances that the system might have, but essentially anything that's ever been built, it doesn't matter if it's a computing device, a bar of soap, a bicycle, it all makes these assumptions that people can do certain things in order to interact with it, right? So the problem happens, well, when do these things break down? What happens when the assumptions we make about what abilities people possess don't match the abilities that people actually have. So what do we do in those situations? So in my dissertation work, I was really interested in understanding the ability assumptions we make when we look at the design of touchscreen devices. So if we wanted to think about like, okay, well, what do we assume people can do when they use a touchscreen? Well, you might assume like, well, somebody could tap with a single finger, if they want to click a button or checkbox or something, they can land and lift within the target, quite accurately. People can do gestures with a single finger, like a swipe, or you can use two fingers to gesture, like pinch to zoom or something like that. And what I found in my research is that people might touch in many different ways. So in a study I did, the Smart Touch study, what we did was we just wanted to ask people with limited mobility, like, hey, if you were to use a touchscreen in whichever way was most comfortable and natural to you, how would you use it? So we found that like, people would maybe touch with multiple fingers. So in the video I'm showing now, there's a small crosshair that's placed on this big touchscreen, and we ask people to essentially touch it whichever way is most comfortable and natural to them. And the person is touching it kind of with their whole hand hitting the screen, but kind of like using their thumb as the primary like implement that's like touching the majority of the crosshair. So you might see touch behaviors like this. You might also see touch behaviors like this participant here, who's kind of using the screen for stability and kind of dragging their hand across and then kind of dwelling when they get to where they want to touch and moving their hand back. And in both of these cases, what happens is that the screen kind of picks up just these like multiple contact points that last for multiple seconds. And the system doesn't know how to interpret that information to actually make it useful, right? How can I actually predict what a person's touching if they're touching in this way that I didn't expect, right? I didn't assume that a person would touch this way. So in this work, what we did was essentially build algorithms to train touch systems to respond accurately to people's touch behavior. So the idea being, hey, if you give me 20 examples of you touching in a certain way, I can model that behavior. Then at runtime, I can give you more accurate touch predictions of where you were trying to touch. So typically my research approach, goes something like this. I like to identify questionability assumptions for whatever technology I'm using or investigating at the time. So that's kind of like the first thing I do. And then the second thing is, second, I like to first collect data to understand people's performance. So maybe that kind of be like 1.5. But the second major thing is like I like to create these interaction techniques that can take advantage of what users can do, and then finally kind of evaluate those techniques with target users. This research approach has been a little different in the last year and a half or so, just because it's hard to do a lot of in-person testing. It's hard to get people to try new technologies, especially things like virtual reality, which people need specialized computers to run. Typically, they're typically quite expensive. People may not have them in their homes, especially because they're inaccessible, right? So why would you want to buy like an inaccessible, computing device just to have at your home? So the stuff I'm going to talk about next is going to be slightly different, but I kind of just wanted to give you all just a little bit of insight into how I typically approach some of these problems. And I'll be happy to answer any questions about any of this at the end. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about the current work I'm doing, exploring these notions of accessible virtual reality. So for those of you who may not be familiar, virtual reality is this kind of immersive interactive technology. Typically, a person puts on a head-mounted display, and then they usually use either hand tracking or these kind of two motion controllers to be able to interact in a virtual environment. And it could be really good for a lot of different applications. So the immersiveness of it is really good for simulations. So people can do things like medical training, the kind of visual acuity you can get from actually having a full kind of 360 display could be really good for certain tasks like architectural walkthroughs. And then probably the most popular task right now that virtual reality is used for is gaming. So this is like an image here, the popular game Beat Saber, where you kind of use these like two lightsabers. It's like a music rhythm game to be able to kind of hit these blocks that are coming at you. So virtual reality can be great for a lot of different things. And as time has progressed, we're starting to see a lot more of these commercial VR systems. So compared to 20 years ago when VR was still more niche and people needed a lot more kind of expertise and like computer graphics and things like that to get these systems off the ground. Now you could just spend $400, get a commercial VR system off the ground, download the SDKs and get to develop it. So they're starting to see a lot more research getting done in the VR space from just more general practitioners because the availability of it is starting to come down. So although virtual reality can have all these great benefits, it also has an accessibility problem. So what I have here is a clip from a post from Scientific American that reads, virtual reality has an accessibility problem. It's been touted as an empathy machine that lets users see what it's like to have a disability, but people with disabilities often can't use it. So this is explicitly to some work that people do in virtual reality, essentially of trying to understand what is it like to embody kind of like a different person. So some people have done these kind of like empathy studies, like, oh, if you are a man, what would it like to kind of embody a avatar of a woman, and how might that change your perception of the environment or your context? Similarly, people have done this with people with disabilities. How would you it gives people a sense to understand like how it might feel to have a cognitive impairment, for example, or a visual impairment. People have done these type of things. But the other part that they're getting at is that people with disabilities often can't use it because the input mechanisms and output mechanisms typically just aren't accessible to a lot of people. The way we've constructed these systems just don't provide opportunities for people with different abilities to engage. So my colleagues and I at Microsoft Research, we wrote kind of like a position paper at the ISMAR conference, I guess 2 years now, called Accessible by Design, an opportunity for virtual reality. And typically, and essentially what we wanted to do here is to highlight what we thought were some high-level themes that people could research right now to try to get more accessible virtual reality applications, systems developed before virtual reality really hits the mainstream, before virtual reality hits kind of like smartphone level ubiquity, right? There's a lot of work we can do before we get to that part to make these systems more accessible. So we identified 5 key areas of focus: content accessibility, interaction accessibility, device accessibility, inclusive representations, and application diversity. So right now, I'm not going to talk about all of these. I'm going to hit on a few, but then I'm going to come to the others later, more towards the end. So first, I want to talk about device accessibility. So like I mentioned, just like 5 minutes ago, all of these devices make assumptions about people's abilities. So these VR systems are no different. They assume that people can wear the headsets, they can hold the controllers, these different things. And this can be problematic. And what's needed is this, this need for more customizable hardware and more integration with current accessible technologies. So the idea being that, people already use a lot of assistive tech right now. Why not leverage the devices people already use in VR instead of requiring them to learn or use different type of input modalities? So we have some examples of this from our research group in different situations. So for example, a few years ago, Yuong, who's now a professor at the University of Wisconsin, I believe, she worked on this project called the Canetroller. And essentially what it is a haptic device that mimics a white cane use in a virtual environment. So the idea would be that you have this haptic cane device that if you encounter an object inside the virtual world, the physical cane will react like, stop like it hit an object, make a sound like it hit an object, based off these brakes and voice coils and sliders and things like that the system has implemented. So this is like an example of, hey, if we can think outside the box a little bit here, we can actually come up with cool, interesting devices that people with disabilities can use that might actually provide them really unique VR experiences, right? But we kind of need to think about those things beforehand. So when I joined the group, this is a couple years ago, I was really interested in understanding like, well, what accessibility barriers do people with limited mobility encounter when they use VR systems? And for people with limited mobility who have already used VR systems, kind of what strategies have they employed to overcome those accessibility barriers? So to do this, we conducted a study. So this is, I think, the summer pre-pandemic. So summer 2019, I guess. So 16 participants with limited mobility. We conducted in-person and remote interviews, and we had 4 participants who had prior VR experience. And so what we did was we had them try 3 different VR applications. So there's AltSpace VR, which is kind of like a social VR application where you can meet up with other people and engage in different activities, like, see a show or a concert or something. Oculus First Contact, which is kind of like a tutorial-based game that kind of gives you the ins and out of how do you use the controls, things like that. And Google Earth VR. So the idea was we want people to try these different VR experiences. It's just to provide us feedback on what they thought about the experience, what worked for them, what didn't. So from this study, we were able to identify this kind of list of 7 VR accessibility barriers. So I'm not going to go through them all, but there are some things here that I did want to talk about briefly. So some of these barriers we found include things like setting up a VR system, putting on and taking off a head-mounted display, adjusting the head-mounted display, cord management, manipulating dual motion controllers, inaccessible buttons, and maintaining view of the controllers. So some of these, you might think like, okay, that's kind of weird. So like adjusting the HMD head strap, you might think that's like trivial, or you might say like, why is that an accessibility concern that we as like a research community should, why should we care about this, right? Like, isn't this more just like a product design type of thing? But it's actually, I find it really interesting. So for example, we had one participant says something such as, one thing I noticed is that the backstrap on the thing is thick. So this is referring to once you put on these HMDs, you typically can adjust kind of the comfort level of it with these different type of straps and wheels and dowels and things like that that could be on it. So he says it does touch my headrest. So it's another factor that makes it a little bit more difficult to move my head. So in general, what this person is saying is that if they use a power chair or a wheelchair and this HMD is so big and bulky that it's actually influencing their ability to use VR while they're inside their chair, and now they can't move their head. Well, if you can't move your head in VR, that's a problem, because a lot of implicit interaction in VR expects people to be able to move your head. Like you survey your environment by just simply moving your head to look around. And if that's inaccessible to you, because the way we design these devices makes it so that it doesn't play well if you're using a power wheelchair, that's a big problem, because it's not just, oh, I had this bulky thing. It's, hey, a huge part of this interaction is now inaccessible to me just because we made this one small kind of like design decision. So I think these are actually important things to consider, because they have these kind of secondary or cascading effects that are important to consider. So some other things that were really interesting. So this notion of like manipulating dual motion controllers. So the idea in VR is that you expect kind of like more physical motion than what you'd expect in a more traditional desktop or mobile computing system. So the idea would be you use both of your hands to control both of your hands of your avatar, for example. But if you're a person with limited mobility in one hemisphere of your body, or if you're a person who's an amputee or a person who's had a stroke and has limited mobility in their left or right side, using two controllers at the same time can be difficult. And then for some people, it's more like, hey, I can maybe use some of it. I can use it some of the time, but not all the time. So for example, participant 14 said, I can use one hand for the controller. So I use my right hand to control one of the sticks. And I think having the one-handed barrier is quite common for people who have strokes. And then we had another participant. Sorry, I just need to move this thing out the way because I can't see my slides. Okay. Participant 2 said, I probably just wouldn't do the ones that require too much coordination. It's a little frustrating to not really be that good at it. And then the last one I wanted to talk about here is this notion of inaccessible buttons. So this is also something that's come up a lot of times, like often in the accessible kind of like video game type of community. It's the idea that you have these controllers that have these like really small buttons, and you're supposed to be able to manipulate multiple buttons at once to do all these different things. So that could be a problem. So we had one participant 6 said, yeah, I think walking was pushing it down. So this is like pushing down with a joystick, pushing one of them down. Yeah, then I have to use two hands and leave the other controller to do it. Yeah, as soon as I heard that you have to push it down, I was like, yeah, no, that's not happening. So essentially, it requires a certain amount of strength to be able to like press down and hold down on one of these buttons or joysticks. And the person was essentially saying, I would have to use two hands essentially just to press down one button, which makes this experience not too great for me. So all of these things we found were really interesting. We think they bring up some really interesting points for what we should be exploring in terms of how to make these systems more accessible. Other things that people mentioned to us were like, well, it'd be great if I could just use alternative input methods. So, like, hey, I already use an alternative input method like a sip and puff device or a quad stick. Why can't I use one of those devices? Or if I use gaze or voice input, why can't those devices be more accessible to me and I use those? So these are great questions. And the problem though is that we're still not quite sure how to design VR experiences using these alternative devices. It's an open question. How would you build a VR experience using just a quad stick or just using a sip and puff device, right? The experience doesn't match the input methods right now. So we need to do some work to think about how we can do that. So this got us really interested in exploring this idea of chairable computing. So my colleague and friend, Patrick Carrington, who's at Carnegie Mellon University, he pioneered this idea of chairable computing. And essentially it's technology that takes advantage of the space on and around a wheelchair, much as wearable computing leverages on body and worn mobile technology. So the idea could be we can leverage the space on the wheelchair to actually use it as places that we can actually put interactive computing components. So we wanted to understand this question of, well, how could we leverage traditional 2D input devices to control more complex spatial interactions? So what we're really interested here is this notion of virtual hand manipulation. So in virtual reality, you can control an avatar who typically has hands, and you can perform these different hand manipulations using these touch controllers. So the idea could be that you can grab objects or do things like a thumbs up or do like a point finger type of thing by pressing or holding various buttons and triggers on these controllers, right? And the thing that we found interesting here is that there's really no parallel for this in the traditional desktop or mobile computing paradigm, right? There's no, like things like drag and drop, right? Like, okay, yeah, we can look at things like, oh, how would I drag and drop one item in VR to another? We can look at desktop mobile systems for comparisons there. There's really not a lot of comparisons for how do you control an avatar's hands in a desktop system or a mobile system. The 2D devices that we built so far to accommodate these things aren't really there. So that's kind of what we were interested in. Like, how would somebody use a more simple, or maybe not even a simple input device? How would they use a different input device to be able to perform these more complex interactions? So we did this user elicitation study where we got participants with limited mobility, and we conducted the study using the CrowdLicit platform that my friend and colleague Abdullah Ali created while he was a PhD student at the University of Washington. So we looked at 16 different hand manipulations, and we used a touchpad as the input device. So essentially the idea would be we would show them a hand manipulation. So for example, like this thumbs up kind of manipulation, and we would say, hey, if you had to perform this interaction, but you only had a touchpad or like a touch screen as your input device, how would you perform this manipulation? Like, what would you do? And the reason why we chose touchpad is because in Patrick's prior work, he found that, like, using an interactive touch surface, kind of like as on the armrest of power wheelchairs, can actually be a really good input method. So we thought about, and also a lot of people who use power wheelchairs might also have touch screens kind of attached to the devices. Maybe they use it for AAC purposes, whatever the case may be. But so we thought that would be like a good implement to start off with. And to analyze it, we use the taxonomy of surface gesture. So essentially you can look at these different types of touch gestures that get created, and you can analyze them based off these different properties. So that's what we did. So I wanted to, so this is kind of like still in progress, but I want to share some of these kind of like initial findings because I thought they were actually quite interesting. So for example, when we thought about looking at, well, how do people conceptualize performing these gestures, what we found was that these discrete hand gestures, so things like a thumbs up or making an index finger or this kind of like index finger plus thumb, was actually really difficult for people to come up with gestures to represent these actions. So 41% of the gestures that we collected were abstract gestures. So an abstract gesture is essentially any gesture in which the gesture itself doesn't really relate to the action being performed. So an example of this could be if you said, if I asked you like, hey, how would you perform this kind of extended index finger plus thumb action? And if you said, I don't know, I would tap on the screen 3 times. That's an abstract gesture. The gesture itself doesn't really correlate at all to what the actual action is. Now, if you compare that to some of these more manipulation type of tasks, what we actually found was that 57% of these gestures were metaphorical. So what is an example of that? So, for example, when somebody wanted to perform a grasp type of action, they would say, well, I would just squeeze, they would say, squeeze your fingers on the touchpad to grab the object. So they're kind of performing this like metaphor of like, well, I would just squeeze my fingers like I'm grabbing an object on the touchscreen, even though that's not what's really done. And then you actually found that this was really great for these dichotomous referents. So for example, grasp and release will be dichotomous. And we found that like, okay, somebody could also say like, oh, for release, I would just extend my fingers to be able to like, to release whatever the cube will be. So we actually found that this was really interesting, these kind of notions of how people might think about ways to do these different things. So like, so why is this important? So like, for example, if you're a designer and you're thinking about, hey, maybe want to be able to create an initial set of interactions that if somebody is using a touchscreen device as a way to implement, it's as a way to interact with VR interfaces, how might we give them an initial set of interactions that could be, recognizable and usable, et cetera. So I think, this thing tells us like, these discrete hand gestures are actually going to be much more difficult for designers to come up with something for, just because the way people conceptualize them are slightly different than maybe some of these more action-based type of gestures, which people might actually be able to come up with more metaphors to explore them. Okay. So yeah, so in total, we did these 16 different ones. So a lot of them, these notions of different type of rotation. So like, how would you roll something to the right or roll something backwards and forward? How would you do these different types of discrete gestures, like, extending the index finger, et cetera. So we're still doing some work on this. Hopefully we'll have more to share with about this soon, but I just kind of want to throw that out there. Some work that Patrick and Abdullah and I have been doing kind of like over the past year or so. So I just wanted to do really break takeaways for this one part, which is about this like device accessibility part. So some things that we talk about in our assets paper from last year was this notion that you really want to be able to design for a few things. So you want to be able to design for interdependence. So there's notion that our participants said that, like, they rely on family and caregivers and friends a lot to do a lot of these interactions with just either computing systems or just normal everyday living. And it came up a lot that, like, hey, if some of these systems were actually designed to facilitate interdependence, you might actually find that you can improve the accessibility of these systems by allowing people to interact with others to perform certain tasks. So that could be really powerful. This notion of customization, I think, is also really powerful, and it's something that's been talked about for a long time. It's often the case that there's not going to be any one size fits all solution for people. So the idea is that you really need to give people the options to tailor their experiences to whatever their abilities are or whatever their preferences are. And without customization, that's going to be really hard to do. This notion of accessibility is really just thinking about ability of people when designing these type of physical devices. What are you assuming people can do, like to put on these headsets and use these controllers? And then I thought something that was really interesting is that participants said to us that, they really care about just being able to engage in the experience, just being able to have that experience to them was important. And what I found in my really brief experience so far of doing VR research is that some creators of VR experiences think of them, similar to kind of like how a film director might think about their movie, right? They might say like, oh, this movie was meant to be seen on like a big screen. It's meant to be viewed in surround sound and all these different things. And I think some creators of VR experiences have a similar type of take. They think like, oh, this experience is supposed to be, they're supposed to be immersive in this way, and people are supposed to do X, Y, and Z. And I think a lot of people are saying like, hey, I just want to be able to have the experience. So it may not matter to me that this isn't the kind of goal experience that the creator wanted. I just want to be able to experience it. So try not to assume how people want to interact with VR systems because it may not match up with reality. Okay. So I know I have like about 10 minutes left because I want to leave like 15 minutes for Q&A. So I'm going to kind of get through these next couple of slides pretty quick, but I think with enough detail that it'll make sense. So I talked about device accessibility. So now I want to talk about interaction accessibility. So I mentioned that VR in a lot of ways requires more physical input and output than these previous technologies. It requires kind of like more full body motion to be able to engage. And as we increase the fidelity of VR input, this actually might amplify these differences. Essentially what we're doing is that as we're trying to make the virtual world as realistic to the physical world as possible in terms of like maybe the physics of it and our movement of it, essentially what we're doing is just importing a lot of the inaccessibility of the current physical world into these virtual worlds. And we don't need to do that. There's, it's not necessary, right? In the virtual world, we have so much freedom and flexibility to change that experience. There's no way to kind of just make this physical analog necessary inside of VR. So again, examples of this from prior work, again, Yuhong's work was looking at for people who had low vision, how could they create more accessible type of interaction methods for them? And they essentially came up with this product called SeeingVR. And the idea was that it's essentially just a host of these different types of virtual enhancements to the scene. An idea could say like, oh, if I need a brightness lens or a contrast lens, or I need to recolor the scene, I can essentially just have this like set of commands at my fingertips, and I could just do these things to whatever works best for me. So again, just want to point out another example of how this is happening in another space. So one thing that I was really interested in terms of this interaction accessibility is this notion of bimanual input. So I want to give a quote from participant 10 from my interview study. I'm not sure that would be possible for me to do them simultaneously, them being like use two controllers at once. If I had to do it, I could do it one-handed, but if I have to do both hands at the same time, that's not going to work. So that kind of got us interested in this question of like, well, how can we allow people to control bimanual interfaces with unimanual input, right? You're a person who wants to have this, or you're engaging in some experience or a game or application that requires you to use two hands or two controllers to perform something. If you could use one hand, how can we still make that possible for you? So this is work that my intern Momona Yamagami did last year. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Washington, who's going to be in the job market, I think, next year. So watch out for her because she's really amazing. So essentially this work that we did was we were trying to understand like, well, okay, how can we explore this problem? So we came up with this framework where we actually borrowed this framework that's looking at bimanual interaction. So I love this stuff. So I'm going to geek out on this for like 30 seconds and then I'll move on. Okay. So there's only, if you think about it, there's these kind of 4 ways for people to perform bimanual interaction. So there's symmetric and asymmetric. So symmetric, it could be symmetric in phase. So in these tasks, both hands are playing the same role and doing the same role at the same time. So you think of it as like jump rope. Both hands are kind of moving in coordination at the same time, doing the same thing. Symmetric out of phase would be both hands are performing the same action, just one after the other. So you can think of this as like climbing a ladder. One hand might go up one rung and another hand will go up another rung. Both hands are doing the same interaction, just out of phase. And then you have asymmetric. So you have asymmetric coordinated. So both hands are playing different roles, but in a coordinated fashion. So you could think of something like cutting an apple. One hand kind of holds the apple and the other hand does the cutting. And then you have asymmetric uncoordinated. Essentially, both hands are performing different roles in which, but not in a coordinated fashion. So like in a video game context, this could be something like, you could have like a shield in one hand and a sword in the other, and you could like bash with your shield while you like thrust with your sword. It's uncoordinated. We can't really determine what you're going to do in those moments. So using this framework, we can think about how we might want to create interaction techniques for enabling bimanual interactions. And if you think about it on a spectrum, you can think of it as like, okay, we can provide less to more autonomy to users depending on what their preferences might be. So for example, less autonomy could be something like, okay, what if we just automatically perform the task? Let's say it requires 2 hands to climb this ladder in this VR game. You could do something where it's just like you approach the ladder and you just kind of automatically climb it, right? You just kind of take that away from the user completely. Another thing you want to do, if you want to do split it down the middle, is you could do something like infer the output of 2 hands giving input from 1 hand. So if I'm just using 1 hand, can I infer what my off hand should be doing given what my 1 hand is doing? And then what will provide the most autonomy would be provide like an alternative input method. So the idea could be, well, how would I want to control my off hand? Could I use something like the headset position, or could I use input that's placed on my foot or on my shoulder or something else to control what the virtual hand could be? And essentially, if you kind of like, lay these things out, you can create a design space, right? You can say like, okay, what could be an automatic solution for a symmetric in-phase task? What could be, alternative input for an asymmetric uncoordinated task, et cetera. So one thing that we explored was this kind of notion of symmetric out of phase. We thought it was really interesting because it kind of gives us a lot of the principles that we can explore from both the asymmetric and the symmetric task. So for example, if I wanted to do something like infer the virtual hand, you could do something like come up with some heuristics or actually come up with these kind of like design principles that say something like, okay, in these situations in which I'm inferring the virtual hand, what I might want to do, for example, is just mimic the direction, speed, and distance of what the virtual hand is doing. So the virtual hand just kind of does this mimicking, type of function where it just does the direction, speed, and distance what the real hand does. So benefits could be that it's like less fatiguing. The person doesn't have to use some type of alternative implement to control the virtual hand, and you might be able to perform movements simultaneously, right? Like you're just using 1 hand and then the second hand is just going on itself. But the drawback is that it's like you have less control, right? So if you wanted to put that offhand in a really particular location, you wouldn't be able to do that. So another notion could be this alternative input. So for example, well, what if I did something in which the virtual hand, the location is really just dependent on wherever I look at in the scene. So maybe it's based off my eye gaze, or maybe it's based off the position of the head mounted display. So this could be really great if I can give myself more autonomy and control. I could perform movements simultaneously, like I can look and use my other hands. I can control both hands at once. But some trade-offs could be associated with this, right? Like you might need the same degrees of freedom as the hand to be able to do some of the same actions, right? So like if I wanted, if I'm supposed to be performing like a rotation along like the Z-axis with my offhand, that's going to be much harder to do, right? If I'm just trying to rotate it with my HMD or something. And all of these interactions may not be accessible to some people. So that's also something you have to take into account. So one way to think about this, so this is like a little brief kind of like demo video that we created. So the idea would be here that you could have this kind of laser that you see is really being controlled by the position of the HMD. So you could kind of perform this like wall climbing task with 1 hand and just, use one hand plus the position of the HMD to perform it, and you can essentially extend this out to whatever task you think might be useful or necessary, depending on the type of environment that you're in. So this is also kind of like work that's in progress. We did this work last summer, but it's really difficult to be able to understand or assess the fidelity of these things because it's really hard to, well, not really hard, it's like impossible right now to actually get people inside the lab to test these things. So what we can do is, demonstrate, show people videos, elicit feedback and responses, but it's really not the same as having people try it themselves. So, initial feedback, some people found it useful, but it's, really difficult to assess about this in-person testing. Okay, so really quick hit to these future opportunities, and then I am done. So I just kind of want to go back to some of the things in our Accessible by Design paper that I didn't really get a chance to talk about more fully. So these last kind of couple are content accessibility. So the idea being that we really don't have agreed upon methods to make content accessible. So for example, 3D video is something that could be a much bigger medium inside of VR than it could be currently on like desktop or mobile systems. But how would you make, what are like the, for example, the mechanisms to make 3D video more accessible? So for example, if you're doing captions for 3D video, what's the best way to make 3D videos captions? Because you're giving people are located spatially in a different way and all these different things. So it could be interesting questions, and there are probably approaches, but there's probably not any standards yet. So this is some of the things that we need to work on. Other things like, understanding the metadata that's necessary, alternative representation. So, for example, if there is something that's sound and you want to be able to display it as text, you need to write metadata to be able to do those things. Inclusive representations is one that we're really interested in, is one that I found really interesting. So the idea would be, once people can actually use VR applications, they're going to want to actually feel included inside these different type of VR environments. And there's this important question here that if you're asking people to embody an avatar, what happens when I embody an avatar that has different physical abilities than I have? If I'm a person who uses a power wheelchair and I'm embodying an avatar that's walking and uses both hands and do all these things, sure, some people do want that experience, and we've talked to people and that's true, but other people actually would prefer different type of experiences, different avatars that might actually be closer to how they identify their identity, right? So there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done here in terms of how we can make inclusive representations inside of VR environments. And then the last thing here is like application diversity. So like I mentioned in the beginning, virtual reality just gives you opportunities to build new types of applications that probably wouldn't be the best for desktop or mobile systems. So things like, virtual orientation and mobility training could be really great in a VR environment. You can give somebody the opportunity to explore a city or a neighborhood in a VR setting using something like the Canetroller, perhaps, as a way to explore a new city without maybe having to physically be there. And then another really popular use of VR right now is like rehabilitation and physical therapy tasks. So how can you use VR more for that? And then, a lot of different things people are looking at now, like, how can we replace physical monitors or virtual monitors? What, accessibility benefits might that provide, because the virtual monitors, you can more easily manipulate those than you could a physical monitor, right? So a lot of different things there. So just to wrap up in conclusion, I really hope that my research today, or what I talked about today, has been able to showcase that, people with limited mobility encounter a lot of these accessibility barriers when interacting with VR systems, and we're still really in the early days of trying to understand how to truly build inclusive VR systems. I think we still have a long way to go. But I think one of the things that could get us there is, thinking about ability and what people can do and trying to leverage that to the best way we can, I think it's going to help us. So like I mentioned before, we can't assume that everyone's going to use the same input devices, for example. It's just not going to happen. It doesn't happen now on desktop systems. So we can't expect that to be true for VR. So why not do the design work right now to figure out how to use a sip and puff device in VR, or how to use all of these different types of implements. So that's what we're trying to do. And hopefully we could pick up some steam there. Yeah, and then the last thing here is how can we promote equity for people with disabilities? How can we build these systems in a way that people feel valued and they feel like they have a stake in kind of where the technology is going and how the technology interacts with them. So yeah, that's it for me. Thanks so much. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Martez, that was a fantastic talk. You already have a few questions that have come in the chat, so I'll start asking you some of the questions here.
Okay.
We had one question from Amanda Lazar, who said she thought that your point was really interesting about how VR can replicate inaccessibility in the world, and would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, yeah, so great. So I think, a lot of the things that yeah, so like there's a lot of embodiment inside of VR. So it's this idea, it's like, okay, you're actually embodying another person or character. So it's like, okay, you're inside this avatar now that's existing in this virtual environment. And the way you control that avatar is primarily through the way that you might think about controlling your own body, right? So if you want the avatar to look around, like you look around yourself. If you want the avatar to raise their hands, you raise your hands, right? But the problem with that is that once we start to think about just incorporating more and more of these physical analogies into these virtual environments, what we're doing is we're designing ourselves into a corner here in which we're saying, hey, VR is supposed to be this kind of life, is, really kind of like this alternative thing for real life, right? You can get in this virtual environment and still perform these actions. And that's just not going to work for so many people, right? Because if we think about just how inaccessible the physical world is, why would we then want to kind of put that at a premium and say, like, that's the experience we want to have in the virtual world? Sure, for some people, that's true. Some people want to have the experience of it making them feel like they're actually climbing Mount Everest or something like that, right? Like they actually want to feel like they're playing like a tennis match or something in these VR experiences. For other people, though, they're just like, hey, these are going to be spaces in which my family and friends and classmates and other people are going to congregate. Other people, this is going to be a medium in which conversations happen, in which news gets shared, probably, and all these different things. I just going to want to be able to have this experience, and I want to be able to tailor that experience to what I can do. And I think that we need to be able to think about mechanisms that would allow that to happen. And I think we have a long way to get there, but I think it's possible. And I think is the more we start to kind of just question these things, and like I know a lot of people are doing like great work on that, like Catherine Gerling and Kate Spill are doing, like they have a great paper at Kai this year that talks about kind of like, how VR systems aren't built to accommodate minority bodies. Like there's just so much kind of like introspective as someone who cares about accessibility, you kind of have to like fight this urge of just like, coming into these like product meetings and being like, yeah, this stuff isn't like great or accessible. Like, what's up with that? Right? You have to like meet people where they are and understand kind of, what their needs are and what their constraints are, and then try to meet in the middle, right? And I think that one of the things that's so difficult about these approaches right now is just that we can't give designer, like we ourselves don't know. So we can't give the designers and the developers the tools they need to make these experiences better. And so for me, I think some of the next phases of the work we're going to do is really looking at the tooling, because if you're building systems and you're saying like, hey, we can't expect everyone to be an accessibility expert, right? Especially in accessibility in all the different types of ways, or like all the disabilities people might have and all the different things that might come with that. So the idea would be that like, well, if I could give you tools and the tools will help you think about these problems, either structure the problems or help you implement some of the things that we're talking about, I think developers or designers would be a lot happier with that. And I think that we're just not at that point right now. Like we're at the point right now where we're like, this is inaccessible, this is bad, but we're like, how exactly do we move forward in terms of fixing it? We're not exactly sure yet. But once we can get some of these tools, like for example, if we can come up with like, Windows has the Windows Mixed Reality Toolkit, Oculus has its own integration with Unity and Unreal and all these different things. If we can get things into the toolkits themselves, I think that will go a long way to helping developers and designers out.
Okay, great. Moving on to the next question from Kent Norman. Have you had any problems with VR sickness, nausea, dizziness, etc.? VR sickness can affect 10 to 20% of participants, depending on length of exposure in the VR system. Some of the methods of alternative input seem like they could increase VR sickness. Can you comment?
So like simulator sickness is a big issue in VR. I think that's one of the, it's probably one of the most well-known type of impediments to kind of like the mass adoption of VRs, because it's like, some people can only be in there for like 5 minutes before they get a headache. So definitely an issue. I think that, so in our current implementation of this alternative input was just like this one example of this like HMD type of thing. But I think the way that we want to think about this more broadly is just that could be anything. So for example, it's like, well, could I put a motion tracker on my like shoulder or my elbow and use that as like an alternative input method? So it's not a hand tracking anymore, but maybe I'm just tracking like another part of my body, like my foot, for example. And then, the idea would just be like, hey, if I can have a different implement and use that in a way that's effective, I think that could work. So yeah, so it may be the case that like using the HMD to control something else might cause, simulator sickness for some people. And they might say like, okay, that's not the alternative input method I want. The alternative input method I want is this other one. And I think that's the idea, right, about this customizability, flexibility. There's not going to be one solution that's going to work with everybody, everyone's going to enjoy. The idea could be, how do we explore the design space to the point, or how do we at least structure the design space to the point where people are at least thinking about this as a problem, right? Like people have to think about like, oh, not everyone can use 2 hands. We might need to think about ways people can still have these accessible interactions, even though they can't use 2 hands. But it's a great point. And I think it's something that hopefully people that do a lot of like the optics and the other stuff that really look at the simulator sickness, maybe that stuff will improve over the next couple of years and maybe less of a problem.
Okay, great. Next question is from Kyungjung Lee, PhD student. Thank you, Martez, for presenting the work. I'm curious how people with visual impairments build their mental mapping when interacting with VR. Also, what would be a way to help them build such perception? It would be great if you could share some of your insights regarding this.
Yeah, actually, I'm just gonna stop sharing my screen because I don't think I'm sharing it. Okay, yeah, so that's a great question. Okay, so I'm gonna start by saying I have no idea. I do not know. I've not done any work in this space, so I'm not really familiar. I mean, if I could just postulate for a second. Okay,
Of course,
I think that, yeah, okay. I think one of the issues with the kind of like the building mental maps problem, I think, comes from just like how people structure virtual environments are going to really be dependent on these cues. So for example, I think if you ask people like, well, how do blind people currently build mental models of places that they visit? So like, how do they build mental models of their office space or their school or their neighborhood, et cetera? And I'm pretty sure you'll hear people talk about different type of like landmarks or cues that they use to help them navigate certain type of spaces. So even though you may not know exactly where you are relative to these things, you might have these different cues and landmarks to help you navigate to get where you want to go. I think that's going to be true for VR environments as well. I think VR environments are going to have these built-in affordances embedded inside of them. That's going to say like, hey, we're going to have navigation cues, other things that's going to help people build up these mental spatial representations of these VR environments. And the best way to do that and how to do that, I'm not exactly sure, but I think it's a great question. Great research project. So
PhD students always have great questions. Okay, next from Evan Golub, faculty member. Actually, everyone so far with questions has been faculty member, aside from one PhD student. It says, you raise many interesting points. It feels like a lot of power over the accessibility experiences created will be in the metaphorical hands of those creating tools like YouTube or WebVR coding libraries or libraries for Unity. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how to bring those tool builders into a conversation, setting aside notions of competition to collaborate on best practices.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And I agree. I think tools will, yes, I agree with the comment. Tools are going to be kind of the like the limiting factor here for a lot of things. Like, for example, people talk about alt text a lot. And it's one of those things that, like, if you don't give people the option to provide alt text, people aren't going to do it, right? So, how long was it until like Twitter introduced that, like, you could just add alt text to whatever photos you have, right? So if Twitter or all these social media companies were like, oh, hey, we're just going to provide that off the box, we're going to give you the tools to make this more accessible, then you give the people the opportunity to take that wherever they want to go. So I think you're definitely right. And I think, so one research thread that I'm interested in exploring is talking to developers, designers, understanding their kind of product cycles to understand, like, okay, what tools would be most helpful to them to help them think about how to structure some of these problems. Like, I think, a parallel for, I think, accessibility is like the security community. Like, not every developer is going to be a security expert, but the idea would be that you want your developers to have understanding of security practices and the tools of these security practices so they can build secure software. I think we want to be able to get to the same space where it's just like, hey, here are the tools to build accessible software. If you choose to use it or not, that's now kind of like a you problem, and you need to kind of look at the mirror thing. But I think, yeah, we need to do that. So I'm planning on doing studies to actually talk to developers to understand what their practices are like, because I don't know, right? I've never been a professional developer. I don't know how they conduct their work in these type of ways, but I'm really fascinated to learn more and to help them, and for them to help us think about like how we can build things that will help them, right? So
Beth, can I fit in one more question? Is there time for one more? Oh, you're muted, Beth. You can just give me
and remember, we have Abrima's question as well.
Okay, well, I want to fit in. We have one more faculty question first, so let me fit in. He says, then if we can go over a minute or two over, I'll fit in the one via email as well.
Okay.
So, we can do Abrima's first, please.
You can do Abrima's first? Okay. Abrima wanted to know more about ability-based design.
Yeah. And
so Abrima wanted you to expand a little bit on ability-based design. Let me just pull up. That one came in via email, so give me one question, one sec here. So his question was, what is your overall take on ability-based design? Can you expand more about leaving users with impairments rather as they are, rather than looking to change systems? So could you just expand a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think ability-based design is really great for certain types of problems. So I think, if you're doing work that's really trying to understand how people interact with input devices, it's this question, right, of, okay, everyone's going to have different abilities. So the way that we might train a speech recognition system to respond accurately to kind of like your vocal patterns, why not have touchscreen systems that respond accurately to your touch patterns, right? Or why not have whatever type of system that can say like, hey, Martez can do these things, Jonathan can do these things. We might need to tailor this experience for Martez and this other experience for Jonathan. It's the same things like with people's abilities change, not just like over time, they change, not like long periods of times, but like even within a day. So for example, when I did my work on the touchscreen stuff, people will come in and say like, oh, I feel really good this morning because I just took my medication. And they will say like, oh, but maybe later in the day, they might experience more tremor or more spasm because they're fatigued, because their medication is worn off, right? So if you could have a system that can say like, hey, I've identified that you're starting to make more errors, maybe because it's later in the day, you're fatigued, you're doing these things. I'm going to automatically change the UI, or I'm going to flip the algorithm that you're using to do the kind of like touch selection to something that can accommodate what we think your abilities are at this any point in time. So I think there's a lot of interesting things that ability-based design can give us in terms of saying like, hey, if we can learn about you, we can tailor experience more towards your abilities.
Okay, great, thank you. And one last question then from Hernisa Kokori. I wonder about any prior efforts looking at viewing a VR world from the perspective of someone who uses a wheelchair. I think there's something, she says, she thinks there's something perhaps about a children's perspective who may view the world at a different height, virtual reality allowing adults to see the world through a child's eyes. And she says she means not in terms of empathy, but in terms of the representation aspect that you highlighted.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So this is something that comes up a lot actually, because like, it's like, once again, to assumptions, some of these assumptions in these games and things like that assume you would be at a certain height and the avatar matches to these certain things. But if you're seated, it's like, oh, the HMD is just doing like the relative position. So it's like, oh, you're crouching or you're doing these other things. It creates these weird mismatches between other avatars in the environment. So I think that's a really great point. I think there is something about, So there's a lot of great work looking at like perception inside of VR that I haven't looked at yet. But one of these things that, Ternisa, to your point, that's going to be really interesting for this is like, for example, virtual meetings that people think are going to happen more in like VR environments. So the idea, for example, if you have a situation in which you have all of these avatars that exist kind of like at eye level with each other, and you have someone who enters the environment and you automatically put them at a different spot, that might cause a lot of problems. Like, for example, it might be like an accidental disclosure of somebody's disability. You may not know this person has a disability until they enter this space. And because the way the system represents them, you could then infer that they have a disability. So I think it's a great question. There's a lot of interesting things to explore there. So.
All right, thank you. Martez, thank you again so much. How about we all give Martez a round of applause, a round of virtual applause. Thank you for such a great talk. This was wonderful. So many interesting questions. Let me ask Beth, do you want to put in a plug for the symposium, the HCIL symposium, which Martez, you too should sign up for. It's free, it's virtual, there are tons of great talks. Beth, do you want to put in a plug and tell everyone how to sign up?
Heck yeah, that was on my plan, but thank you very much. Okay, so here we go, sharing screen. We have a lovely program planned. It's all day, it's virtual, May 27th, 2021. And
Beth, always use your desktop, you don't see anything.
Can't see your screen.
Louise, let's try this again, take two, hold on. I thought I had it, okay.
You can start talking about it in the meantime. It's a great program. It's right. It's wonderful. It's a whole day of talks. There are tutorials as well, right? No, that's the bill for sponsorship. You don't want that.
I know, I'm getting there. I'm sorry. You keep talking. I will.
Actually, Tammy, is Tammy still on?
Yeah.
Tammy's the symposium. Tammy, I'll let you have the great honors. Oh, I thought I heard Tammy say yes. Is Tammy not on? Maybe Tammy is not on. Okay, so the symposium, there you go. It's now on the screen. It's May 27th. It is, it's our big annual event that describes all the work being done at the HCIL. You've got talks about AI. You've got talks about accessibility. You've got a few plenary ones in the morning, right? You've got accessibility, AI, children, health, user-centered design, visual analytics, privacy, security, information behavior, accessibility, learning, computing and math, creativity, collaboration, information visualization, accessibility. It sounds just like the Chi conference, except it's only one day and it's free. I mean, what could be better than that, right?
Oh yeah, and it's virtual and anybody from around the world can come, and we're up to over 350 registrants and from, again, all over the world. So many countries are represented and we're really excited. And if you notice, we also have two tutorials. Ben is giving one on human-centered AI, trusted, reliable, and safe and trustworthy, and also introduction to usability testing by Bill Killiam. And we have a really awesome, fun virtual happy hour that you can't miss. It's going to be so cool. So please register, looking forward to it. And as I say to this group over and over again, we're going to need a lot of volunteers to help, because if you notice, for each one of these sessions, check it out. There's 4 sessions in this one, 4 talks in this one session. So we have a lot of concurrent things happening. And this girl only has 2 hands and 1 brain, and I need many more hands and many more brains to help me. So look forward to some invitations for that. But 2 more talks coming up before the end of the semester. Thanks everyone for coming. And again, a final thank you to Martez. We really appreciate it.
That's right. Martez, thank you again so much. What a treat. What a pleasure. And I look forward to seeing you eventually in person sometime soon.
Yes, no, thank you all for having me. This was great, so much fun. Thank you all for the questions. This is amazing. It gave me a lot to think about. So thank you.
All right.
Righty. Thank you, everybody.
Martez.